This podcast is the design of City Sites Urban Media, and our goal is to bring into focus the difference between culture and God's ideas found in His Word. To learn more, go to citysitesurbanmedia.com.
There's been some backlash about Me Too and some anxiety, as you might imagine.
Many male managers and owners are feeling a little bit more tentative when working with and managing their female workers.
A large percentage of male managers were concerned about working with women one-on-one in the workplace. They were concerned about mentoring women. They were saying they were afraid to have meetings with women, to travel with women, and so on. It indicates that there are anxieties and fears that we need to address.
I think all guys know how to behave. When you're with a female worker, you talk about business. You keep things professional. There's a clear line about what your behavior should be. And in fact, the behavior that you have around female workers really shouldn't be any different than the behavior that you have around male workers. If you're avoiding working with a potential female colleague just because she's female, and just because you're concerned about how your behavior might be, you not only hurt yourself, but you're hurting your organization as well.
But from an issue of dignity and value, the scriptures are exceedingly clear. In Galatians chapter 3, Paul says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free man, neither male nor female, for you're all one in Jesus Christ. That's talking about redemption. That's talking about reconciliation to God. It's talking about our value as individuals. People get in trouble with this because they believe if you don't do a certain thing, you're not as valuable as somebody else who does another thing. The scripture talks about how we do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, consider others as more important than ourselves. Don't merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interests of others. So as elders of this church, we are constantly going to women and saying, we need your help. What's a woman's perspective on this?
This is the City Sites Podcast with Larry Kutzler.
I have watched female leaders in the church over the years trying to figure out just how they feel about themselves as leaders. Questions like, do female leaders feel pressured to act more masculine than feminine as they lead? Do female leaders get the respect equal to a male leader? And what do people expect from a female? Well, the differences between the sexes have become clouded, and the roles of men and women have become more blended than in previous years. However, I want to talk about a woman's perspective as it relates to the leadership in the body of Christ. We know some churches will not permit a woman to be a pastor or hold a teaching position since their doctrine restricts senior leadership to men only. Yet, regardless of the obstacles a woman has to face with her gender in the church, she plays an integral part of the leadership in the body of Christ. With me today are two female pastors who have been in leadership for decades, and I want to get their perspective on church life for a female as a pastor and ministry leader. With me today is Reverend Jamie Morrison and Reverend Pam Braman. Jamie has been a pastor in a local church alongside her husband for many years and is currently in a leadership position in a nonprofit addressing poverty issues in our community. Reverend Pam Braman has been a pastor in the past and now is the superintendent in New York State for the Free Methodist denomination. Jamie and Pam, thanks for joining me. So Jamie and Pam, thank you for joining us today. And I'm just wondering from your perspective, if you've seen women become more emboldened in recent years due to the movements such as Me Too movement, do women feel a little bit more encouraged and to voice their opinions and get involved with change as far as the gender inequities are concerned, both in society as well as the church?
One of the things that Me Too did was it shone a light on some of the realities of sexual harassment, sexual molestation, seeing women as sex objects. And so it allows that conversation to happen. I wish that the church had been at the forefront of that, because as I look at the life of Jesus, I see how he always saw women. He didn't see them as sex objects. He didn't see them as the women. When Mary sits at his feet in the position of a rabbinical student, he welcomes that. And he doesn't say, oh, no, you're supposed to be in the kitchen with your sister. So I think it's at least brought up the conversation. I'm not sure I'd use the word emboldened, but it's brought the conversation up in churches.
Yeah, I would would agree with that. I think women have been moving more toward the forefront probably over the last, particularly 10 to 15 years. They have been fighting for rights, making progress, etc. I think, however, the Me Too movement, where I see the change is we're seeing it happen in Minneapolis right now. Any oppressed group, I think, can tend to see militant at its formation and for a season. And I think the Me Too movement is coming out with a very real issue, an issue that all people are created equal and should be treated with the same equalities. But I think the Me Too movement has moved people toward feeling more aggressive and aggressively going after a topic that has been needed to be addressed, but maybe with a bit more aggression. And so we're seeing anger, but I think that anger is related to some of the oppression that's happened. So I think it's been ongoing. Me Too has just made it come more to the forefront, and I think they don't feel maybe that progress has been made quick enough, and so anger is coming out of that.
So how can females help other people understand sexism? I mean, it's really a delicate subject to be brought up, but the conversation has to be made. How should it be made?
As a Christian woman, I'm always asking for Holy Spirit guidance, because there are times when you're in a situation and you recognize like there's sexist things being said or you're not being listened to as a woman. It's just important to just let it go in Christian love. And then there's other times when it's like, it's really time to speak up. Sexism and racism, actually, there's a lot of similarities. When it's blatant, it's easy to point it out, right? It's easy to say, look, this was unfair. And yet so much of it is fuzzy. And it's that place where you're sitting in a room and you're thinking, why am I not being listened to? And yet you can't really put your finger on it. So it's hard. I know in the churches I oversee, one of the best ways to fight sexism is to see women being effective pastors. And as other churches see women as effective pastors, then they're more likely to say, well, yeah, we could have a woman pastor in the future. I'm
interested in that. I want to follow up on that. How do you see a woman being effective? How do you gauge that?
I would gauge it the same way I would gauge a man's effectiveness. So church health, church growth, people coming to know Jesus, people growing in their faith, people serving the Lord, new leaders being raised up. I would gauge it the same way.
Okay.
That's what sort of allows people to say, oh, a woman can do this. So often I've heard, well, a woman can't. And sometimes the reason people think a woman can't is because the only opportunities that women have had is in places where, well, the church is about ready to close. Let's throw a woman in and see if she can do anything. And nobody could have turned it around.
Right.
But when women are allowed to minister effectively and people can see that, then I think it changes the conversation.
I have been a part of a church where a woman was the senior pastor, and I can tell you she was much more sensitive to issues, for sure. And of course, I know Jamie personally, and she's ministered to me on many occasions. So Jamie, how would you answer that same question?
I don't know that I see a difference between the measurement for males and females, and I believe that Pam reiterated that as well. I think the only distinctive that I would add to what Pam had already shared is I think women as a whole have to work harder still even today at proving their worth as a leader, particularly within the context of the church. I also am a leader of a nonprofit organization, and within the context of the world, I believe that I'm accepted much more readily in that environment as a female working alongside my male counterpart. But I think within the church as a whole, we're still somewhat behind in how we grade women in leadership.
Jamie, you've been a pastor alongside your husband for many years. Do you seem to have the same respect as he does in the congregation?
I do not. Men are territory takers, typically a little bit more aggressive, and I'm not speaking in the negative vernacular. I'm speaking in the positive vernacular than what women are. I think women, I often say, are more often community keepers. We are not necessarily just supportive. We're leaders in our own rank, but I don't think that we necessarily engage in the aggressive encounters as much as our male counterparts. So I think that there is a distinctive difference in how both Sean and myself approach leadership. What we've found is typically when there needs to be an aggressor, Sean's the one that's called more often. When there needs to be care and when there needs to be counsel, often I'm the one that's called more often.
Pam, how do you relate to that in terms of your corporate work now amongst the denominational leaders?
Yeah, so I have to do both the care and the confrontation, and that's just part of the job. I may approach it differently. As Jamie was talking, I was thinking about an article I read a couple of years ago, and this was in the business world, why women haven't made it as often to the top-level positions. And one of the theses, which I found fascinating, was that when women lead, they lead as a we, right? So they gather together people, they lead in community, and when they communicate how they're leading, they say, we decided this, we did this is the direction we have gone. But then when they're interviewing for top-level positions, people don't want to hear we, they want to hear I. And so women were actually hindering themselves. They might have been outstanding leaders, leading whole teams of people, bringing people along, and yet because they would say we, people would hear, oh, you didn't really do that, somebody else did. And I do think there is an aspect, not always, but often, working more with community and bringing people along rather than being out in front and everybody following.
Okay, so Jamie and Pam, as Pam, you're speaking about this we. Isn't that more of a better model of the New Testament leadership than I, like the superstar kind of guy?
I think it's a both and, right? There's certainly, as you look through the scriptures, there's times when, Joshua took territory and was clearly leading the charge. And yet certainly the council in Jerusalem with the apostles making decisions corporately was a much more we model. And I think a lot of that has to do with not just gender but culture as well. I do like to say I think as we become a more global culture, women actually have an advantage because the rest of the world is not nearly so independently minded as we are in the U.S.
I think Pam and I come from two different forms of leadership. She has been a sole leader, where Sean and I have always been Priscilla and Aquila ministry. So I love listening to her as she's talking about her form of leadership. For Sean and I, it's always been a we, and we distinguish our roles by virtue of our call and by the strength with which God's gifted us in different areas. So there has been a real distinctive for us. I find it interesting, though, that when people speak about Sean and I's ministry, they incorporate it. It's not just Jamie's leadership or Sean's leadership. It's always Sean and Jamie's leadership. And quite frankly, we love that because that's who God's called us to be.
In light of what we're talking about here, do you think that there is more pressure on females to act more masculine than feminine in their leadership styles?
Well, so much depends on the place and the setting and what the expectations are. I will say this, sometimes it's a matter of not having enough women models. So I remember, this was long, long ago when I was first in ministry and I was preaching at a church, and someone on the staff said to me, "You preach like a man." And I said, well, that's fine, but I don't know what a woman preaches like. And I really didn't at that point. I hadn't heard women preach. And all my seminary professors had been male. And so I think that's part of it. It took me a long time to find my own preaching voice because I just didn't have the models that I needed.
I would certainly concur with that. I don't know, within the church, I don't know that I see a difference or a mandate of women to become more masculine. I think we see a trend in the non-Christian culture for sure, but within the church, I've never felt that I needed to become a male in order to be able to be respected. What I have found is probably quite the opposite, is that my gifting and my calling has gained me the respect within the church because I know how to stay in my own lane. And I walk in my gifting. And I think that there's a difference between walking in security versus insecurity. Security says, I know my call, I know what I'm called to do, and I'm not looking to feel needed. I'm just fulfilling the call. But when we minister out of insecurity, we're looking around for the pats on the back. We're looking to do what everybody else is doing. And that's, I think, when it becomes detrimental. But I would say that that's for men and or for women.
So, in conclusion today, what would you say, for example, to church leadership if they were considering to hire a female leader of whatever kind of position? What would you say to them to be on the positive side of that decision?
I mean, I go back to Genesis, right, where we are male and female. We are created to be in the image of God. And I think when it's healthy to have both men and women sitting around the table is really vital for us to be reflecting the image of God in leadership and in the church. But it's got to be intentional, right? Just all of a sudden throwing a woman into a staff of men and assuming there doesn't have to be conversation and listening on both sides, it's just not going to work. So it has to be intentional, and you have to ask the question of how to move forward. I love what Jamie said about call. I think for a woman, I think for anyone, if you know that you're called and you know that you're gifted, then you walk in the confidence of Jesus. And as soon as that starts getting haywire, that's when things get out of whack. So in a church that's looking to hire, again, I'd say, is the woman called? Do people believe she's called? Is she gifted for what you're asking her to do? Then I think there's a wonderful journey ahead.
I think there's so much focus on the male and the female issue as a whole. I don't want to be hired because that church needs a female. I want to be hired because, within the church context, because God has gifted me with what is needed for that environment, and I'm called by God to that environment. My perfect scenario would be to have no names on a resume and have experience and education on that resume, and then the best person is hired, whether they're male, female, whatever their ethnicity is. That would be my ideal. But I think we focus so often on making sure that the minority voice is represented within the context of the church. I think we need multi-ethnicity, but not just because, and or females, but not just because we need that token individual. I think it really does need to come down to call.
I sure appreciate this, because I think in a multicultural world, a global community, we need both genders working at their best to minister the need.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's all very clear the first person to see the risen Jesus were the women. And particularly, the first people to be told to tell other people that Jesus is alive again. Mary Magdalene and the others. Now, all Christian ministry flows from the announcement that the crucified Jesus has been raised from the dead and is now the Lord of the world. This is just a cultural revolution that Jesus had up till then chosen 12 men. He now transforms that. This is part of the newness of new creation, it seems to me, by saying, now actually this extraordinary explosive message is so subversive that the best people to take it, strange women who no one's going to believe, and indeed the disciples themselves don't, but they were telling the truth. And it seems to me we need to inhabit that story and that way of looking at that story and say, so was this just a flash in the pan? Absolutely not. Read Romans 16. Romans 16 is explosive. Paul greets all these church leaders in Rome, many of whom are women who are church leaders in their own right, one of whom is an apostle, he says so, Junia. This is a female name, and she is an apostle. For Paul, that means somebody who has seen the risen Jesus and is thereby commissioned to be an authorized representative. And here's the crunch. The first woman mentioned in Romans 16 is the bearer of the letter to Rome. Now, if you're Paul and you know in your bones you have just written a letter which is the most explosive piece of theological writing you can imagine, who are you going to give it to take it to be read under Caesar's nose in Rome? Well, presumably some strong man. No, a deacon woman from the church in Kenkreai. We assume she's an independent businesswoman, Phoebe, and she's on the way to Rome. And what we know about the way letters worked in the ancient world was if you sent a letter via a friend or somebody, the chances are they would be the one to read it out. They might well be the one to explain it.
Thank you for joining us today. Every Friday, we bring you this podcast with interviews with people who are challenging the status quo of Christianity and challenging the cultural norms of our day. Please help us get the word out by sharing the link to this podcast with your online friends and family. Our website also contains other podcasters who are a part of the City Sites network of communicators, all sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Our website is citysitesurbanmedia.com.